if you're a lawyer, you have two hurdles to overcome when it comes to generating new leads or acquiring new clients. One is visibility, right? You need to stay top of mind because legal demands, think of a litigator, it's very unpredictable. Litigation doesn't happen on a schedule, so you need to be there, visible to the prospective client at the moment that need arises. And your thought leadership can be very helpful in that regard. You also need to build trust. Because these are high stakes, you need to be perceived as the right option to help with this situation.
There's been a small thought leadership agency that I've admired for years, and it specializes in law firms and lawyers. Harrington Communications is run by Jay Harrington and his wife, Heather. They launched the firm nearly 20 years ago in Traverse City, Michigan. Previously, Jay was an attorney at big law firms, Skadden Arps and Foley and Lardner. Today, he has a newsletter of nearly 5,000 subscribers that gives advice to lawyers and law firms about thought leadership. Jay also posts regularly on LinkedIn. In our discussion, we spoke about how Jay recognized thought leadership marketing for law firms to be a good career path, the keys to building his business, state of thought leadership in law firms today versus a decade ago, and where he sees thought leadership going in the legal industry over the rest of the decade. Hey, Jay, great to have you on my show. I was on your show 2 years ago, and I really enjoyed the discussion about what we have in common, which is thought leadership for B2B firms. Although you're focused, I think we've had in my career in thought leadership since 98, having my own firm, I think I've worked for exactly 2 law firms. So probably less than 1% of the combined revenue since then has been for law firms. But you're showing that it can be done, that somebody can thrive in thought leadership marketing, thought leadership PR, thought leadership content development for law firms. So I congratulate you there. I failed at that market. Let me put it that way.
Well, it's funny, Bob. Yes, that is our market. You probably don't remember this, but I posted something on LinkedIn years ago. It was related to thought leadership for law firms. I don't remember exactly what the nature of the post was, but before you and I knew one another, you commented on that post and mentioned something about, you perceiving the law firm market to be not a particularly great market for this, and comparing and contrasting it to something like management consulting. And you made a lot of great points. You frankly, I remember that because it made me stop and pause and think, am I making the right decision here? And I think a lot of what you said is very true, and probably are objectively better markets for this, but we found our place in it, and it's turned out to be a good one. And I think that's part of the thing that we've seen with respect to the legal industry for years, which is it's a bit of a follower of the other professional services firms, particularly management consulting, in terms of adapting to new techniques, new approaches, new ways of marketing and growing their businesses. And, I sort of maybe was on the early edge of it, but the market's kind of caught up. And now I feel like thought leadership is such a big topic in legal industry.
So looking back, do you think it helped to have been a lawyer as opposed to not a lawyer to crack that market?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think for one thing, this could cut both ways. And I wasn't exactly sure how it would be received. But I think in general, overwhelming number of opportunities that we've had, it's been a positive. Some cases, you'll meet a skeptical lawyer, which is pretty common, that thinks like, why would I hire you? You're like me. I don't know anything about this. Why do you know anything about it? Why should I hire you? And that happens, of course. But in general, I think that most lawyers and legal marketing professionals, those who might hire us, perceive it as a value of, we know what it's like to be in your shoes. I know what it's like to sell legal services. I know how kind of this aspect of marketing fits into the pipeline and how to deal with attorneys and just generally understand the profession and how they operate. So it's been a positive.
Okay, so earlier in your career, before the thought leadership, before Harrington Communications, you were at big law firms, Skadden, Foley and Lardner. When did you recognize that thought leadership marketing, your firm, was a career path you wanted to go down? What precipitated that and what led you here?
Yeah, so you're right. I started my legal career as a practicing lawyer at Skadden Arps, a big firm that was in Chicago. And then in around 2005, moved back to the Detroit area, which is where I grew up, to join Foley and Lardner, another large firm that was opening their Detroit office. After a couple years, right in the midst of the financial crisis, and in Detroit, the automotive crisis. If you remember, GM and Chrysler filing for bankruptcy in 2009, and a cascade of suppliers in that industry. A good friend of mine, one of my best friends, and I split off from the big firm when we started our own. So did that for a number of years before joining my wife, leaving the practice of law, joining my wife, who had already established a marketing agency. So that gets us up to about 2012. Now, as far as the thought leadership aspect of what we do, I didn't really think about that as a big aspect of our marketing agency, which was starting to niche down to just serving the legal industry over that period of time, until we moved about 250 miles north into northern Michigan, where I wasn't 250 miles in proximity from any of my clients or even any target clients. So marketing, in particular thought leadership marketing, became a much bigger aspect of building our agency and acquiring clients. So I started blogging. I wrote my first book in, I think, 2017. I started to recognize, like, okay, I became a practitioner, and I saw this is working. This is very valuable. And I'm selling expertise. Lawyers are no different. I should be, consulting and executing on behalf of lawyers with the skill set that I've developed for myself. So that was the rationale, and it was around that time frame.
So you could do it from Traverse City because your clients were not around Traverse City. They were anywhere
but
that connection, basically.
Yeah, there was no client base for us up here, really. Just sort of, small law firm, boutique kind of stuff. And that wasn't really our client base. What was interesting was that when we were in a market like Detroit, there was plenty of business in our geographic proximity. So that's really what we focused on. And we had a nice client base, and we had a few clients scattered elsewhere as well. But it wasn't until I went from a kind of a business development mindset of developing relationships, attending events, that kind of stuff that I had to do in person, to more of a marketing mindset of like, I'm going to put my ideas out there and sell on that basis, that we unlocked, we unlocked the country as a target market. And that happened slowly over time. But like our Michigan is a relatively minuscule portion of our overall client base. It's all over the country, and in some cases all over the world.
Is that right? Because the principles of legal marketing apply whether they're here or in Europe or Asia Pac?
Yeah, generally. Now, I should say some of the international work is focused a little bit more on the training work and the coaching work that I do, which is, a little different as opposed to the thought leadership execution. But it, nonetheless, one thing tends to lead to another, and there's something that gets our foot in the door. And so, yeah, it's the dynamic is a little different, I think, when it comes to, how people think about creating content in other parts of the world. But certainly in the US, it's pretty much obviously the same, regardless of where you're operating, whatever state you're in.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the training work.
Mm-hmm.
What's that about? How does it fit with thought leadership?
Yeah. So thought leadership's a component of it. So most of the training is devoted to, I'll call it business development and marketing. So really geared towards individual lawyers who are looking to build their own legal practice. And, the way I usually describe it is I'm talking about like, all right, what are the tools in the toolkit you have to work with? I mean, one is business development, right? And I define that as one-to-one relationship building. This is where you are having lunch with a prospective client. You are on a phone call, attending an event with someone, entertaining, that kind of thing. You can also do business development from your desk, obviously, as well as in person. And then next is marketing. So thinking about how can you pair your business development with marketing. And marketing is what I distinguish from business development as it's one-to-many. It's something that scales in a way that business development cannot. And it allows you to really focus your business development on your most important relationships. So, most lawyers or any profession who's selling, sophisticated professional services, my advice is always identify, 20 to 30 of your most important high potential relationships, focus your business development time, your one-to-one relationship building time on those contacts, but then use something like thought leadership marketing as a nice complement to that. So you can not only have assets to stay top of mind with those folks, but reach your broader network and your broader contact base and bring new people into the fold, allowing them to discover your ideas and sort of opt into your ecosystem. So they're getting more of what you have to say and think. So as it relates to the training, we're talking about how to develop a strategy for yourself to build your practice that oftentimes involves aspect of both business development and marketing.
And would it be fair to say, at least this is what happens in the consulting industry, that business development becomes a lot easier for lawyers if they're recognized, if they've done some thought leadership writing and that kind of thing, and the leads are coming to them, the phone calls are coming to them saying, hey, I loved your white paper or your article about this. Can we talk?
Yeah. Yes. Although I would say that, so here's how I have come to think about this. That happens. It's certainly not something that never happens, but in the legal industry, I think it's a little less common where you're getting inbound inquiries, at least so the way I think about it is, if you think about like a 2x2 matrix, and on the bottom is low stakes, and on the top of the left quadrant is high stakes, and then on the bottom right quadrant is low complexity, and on the far right, high complexity. When you're talking about high stakes, high complexity work, thought leadership is something usually that is a reinforcement mechanism for someone who has been referred to a client or is otherwise known for their reputation, sometimes through their thought leadership as well. So I think it's really a complement and a reinforcement mechanism for people who are competing for that high stakes, high complexity work, where the rates are really high and this is the work you really want to get, as opposed to a discovery mechanism that leads to inbound leads. It could be a conversation starter that starts a relationship, gets you on someone's radar screen, and then it's your job to nurture that relationship and build trust over time, in part through continued thought leadership that you're serving to that individual. But I read something you wrote, I've called you or emailed you, and I want to talk about, a new matter that we have. I think it's a little less common in the legal industry just because of the nature of the work to some extent. That's just been my, perhaps anecdotal, but I think that's true in general. The biggest change in thinking I've had about this over the years has been that, if you're a lawyer, you have two hurdles to overcome when it comes to generating new leads or acquiring new clients. One is visibility, right? You need to stay top of mind because legal demands, think of a litigator, it's very unpredictable, right? Litigation doesn't happen on a schedule. So you need to be there, visible to the prospective client at the moment that need arises. And your thought leadership can be very helpful in that regard. You also need to build trust because these are high stakes. You need to be perceived as the right option to help with this situation. So there's a nurturing process. It doesn't go from, I met this lawyer to I'm going to hire them. There's oftentimes a fairly long cycle and process of nurturing that relationship to the point you get to that level of trust. And so I tell my clients oftentimes, don't necessarily think of your thought leadership marketing as the way you would think about it of just a general marketing asset. Create it with one person in mind and literally use it as a way to add a value-added touch point to that relationship. Write it for one person and send it to that person, via email with a note to that person, right? Don't just count on it being blasted out as a client alert. Don't just count on someone bumping into it on LinkedIn. Like, use it as a business development asset, a touch point for that person. Naturally, it's going to apply and be relevant to others as well, but have that mindset of, I need valuable touch points with these clients and prospective clients. And by writing something that's valuable to them, like, that's a very valuable touch point. So that's kind of the way I'm thinking about it these days. Not as much as a pure lead generation tool, the way it is for me in my business, because the stakes are lower, right? I'm an advisor on marketing and business development type things. I oftentimes will write something and I'll get a phone call and I'll get hired. It's a little different with my clients.
Yeah. So what's been the evolution of your firm? Did you start with the solo lawyer and then work up to larger mid-sized practices in big law, or did you start with big law and then,
Yeah.
you found a sweet spot somewhere else?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. A little bit of a mix. I mean, we've from a very early stage, we started working with some very large firms, some of the biggest in the world. We also, have always had some smaller clients as well. The mix of the work is oftentimes different because we still have a little bit of a traditional marketing agency approach with some clients where we're on retainer, we're sort of their outside arm, and we're handling the email newsletters and we're doing some design work as needed, that kind of thing. There are other clients though where it's much more of, the big law firm where we're oftentimes working on something like strategy for a particular practice group as it relates to their thought leadership marketing. That's pretty common engagement these days. The biggest evolution has probably been one from we are your implementers and executors of this strategy, meaning we would oftentimes be ghostwriting thought leadership content for many of our clients. That I guess but we didn't necessarily want to scale that. That was a little bit selective, and we just realized that was not the path we wanted to go down. So the biggest evolution has been from one of more implementation to more of the strategic thinking that leads to the implementation that we're not necessarily part of.
Yeah. And so what happens? They say, hey, I have 10 white papers. Our firm is big enough. We can afford a dozen or 10 white papers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have the resources to do it? Do you say no, but we have other people who can do it? What do you do with those leads?
I usually say no. And I don't, it's bad because I am very happy to refer work. It's just sometimes hard to make that referral. I mean, I try to say like, look, you guys can chip away at these things and do these internally and give them some processes as part of the strategic thinking of like, here's how to implement this in a more systematic way. It doesn't always work the way. It's not to say that I'll never do that kind of thing. Like I have a California law firm client where they wanted a like litigation trends kind of white paper written. And I did that one. That was like last fall. Kind of reminded me as to why I don't do it anymore because it requires a lot of time, which I don't necessarily have enough of these days. But yes, if I have the right outsource referral partner, and maybe this is a call for people to contact me if they feel like they've got the chops to do this kind of writing, I'm always happy to refer it out.
Okay, very good. So it seems like you and your firm are in a very good place.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, it's a nice mix. I do think that it's something that I wouldn't necessarily say I had designed out 10 years ago, but the mix of strategy plus training plus one-to-one coaching that I do with specific lawyers, it's a nice mix where it's not just one tiny like thing that could ever go out of style. You know what I mean? Like SEO, for example, I'd be concerned if I had like an SEO agency. Maybe I shouldn't be. It's just my impression of it. But to be that narrowly focused on one area of expertise would probably give me some sleepless nights.
Well, also, I guess with generative AI, we'll do a lot of the writing, no matter how you feel or how I feel about it.
Yeah.
Companies are using it.
They are.
It's right.
Totally.
Using it to edit, aren't they?
Oh, 100%. And I mean, I think they should be using it quite a bit. It would be crazy not to. I honestly am pushing more of my clients. I'm beating this drum relentlessly. Like, this is a very valuable tool that you should be using in some respects. I'm pushing them to do something they don't want to do, though. There's so many lawyers, and this isn't an absolute statement, but I would say if I had to estimate, 8 out of 10 lawyers, especially at the larger firms, are so scared based on the headlines of lawyers in their legal briefs getting sanctioned because they used ChatGPT and it hallucinated and put in a fake case, and now they're on the headlines of all Bloomberg Law, and so understandably they're hesitant to use some of these tools. But I always tell them, like, your marketing and business development is a sandbox in which you should be learning how to use these things effectively because you will have to be before long, and I think that day is today, honestly, especially when it comes to your marketing.
I agree. I've used ChatGPT 4.0, and I have found I see the hallucinations when I say, "Tell me about Robert Buday," but I've also seen it to conduct amazing market research in, of course, minutes.
It's magic in many ways. I mean, it's a polarizing topic, especially for those of us who write. But I mean, gosh, it's such a time saver. And I think most of us, if listeners to your podcast are the type of people who pay attention to these issues, we're not talking about like putting in a prompt to write something, it spits it out and you publish it. It's like, it's a tool. It's an amazing tool to supplement time you would spend on Google trying to go down rabbit holes to verify information or just find it in the first place that takes forever. Or to figure out that metaphor you can't come up with, or, a historical analogy to something. Like, it's so good at these things. It's crazy not to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you stand back and you look at, what you've accomplished, did you have any doubts along the way where you said, I'm not sure I've made a good decision here. I think I should go back to either my own law firm or go back to a mid-sized or a big law firm? Were there any moments, crises, let's say, where you said, this is not working out as I thought? If so, how did you deal with it?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I don't know if I ever, I mean, of course, we all have various struggles. I mean, and there's times like during COVID where you're like, is this all going to fall apart? Well, at least I used to be a corporate bankruptcy lawyer. And if it all does fall apart, I can always fall back on that. But never any, existential crises where it got to that point where I was even really considering it. So, but yeah, I mean, all of the growing pains of growing an agency and serving clients in different domains and losing a client that, seemed like a cataclysmic moment for a few days. And then somehow out of the blue, I guess karma in a good way works and you get a new opportunity and you keep going. So, I definitely, we've gone through, so many different iterations of maybe this is the thing, and maybe we should do an online course, and maybe we should do a membership community. So we've experimented at all these different domains. And ultimately what it's come down to is really just continuing to move into a position where how can we most impact revenue for our clients? And what I've found is like, some aspects of what I think is the most valuable, important part of their marketing, and then also how to advise their individual lawyers to actually go out into the marketplace as a rainmaker themselves and like bring in business. And since that's where we've really landed on with our agency, like, it's given me a much greater comfort level as to we're in a good spot as to how we've grown and whatnot. But sure, I've had plenty of crises moments. Luckily, most of them were short-lived, and I never went back to the practice of law.
I've had the same, and they typically have been over two things: deep recessions, so 2001, 2008, 2009. So over economic downturns, like nobody's getting work, and you really got to scramble. And the antidote has always been, you got to write more, you got to publish more. And that seems to help. The other is partner changes, or you split with a partner. And I've done that twice now.
Yeah.
And those are times of upheaval too, because I'm the sole owner of Buday TLP. I was co-owner with Bloom Group before that. Those can be tumultuous.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and we've had a little of that as well. And yeah, it is tumultuous and it seems difficult to navigate, but you get through it. And I guess it's just the nature of being in business for yourself. And my wife and I were just having this conversation this morning, and I'm like, anyone who owns an agency or is in this business or any professional services, it's like, no client is forever. You're going to churn over time. You see that if you're in it long enough, that you replace the clients you lose and hopefully you can keep growing. And I guess, I always try to consider what's the alternative? What's the counterfactual here? And it's like, I'd rather have a portfolio of, 20 clients where, everyone you lose hurts a little bit, but, you typically only have one job. And I'd rather take this risk profile rather than just have all my eggs in one basket at this point in my life and career.
Yeah. It would also be fair to say that working in a big law firm, perhaps unless you are a partner, but working at a big law firm is not risk-free either from an employment standpoint, right?
Oh, no.
Make a downsize, you could lose your job, you rub somebody the wrong way, et cetera, and so on, right? That's not a risk-free environment either.
No, it's not at all, especially these days. And especially for, young lawyers, and this is another area where I think AI will continue impacting that industry in particular at the junior level. I mean, I'm not directly exposed to the hiring market, although I do some work for some legal recruiting firms in our business. But yeah, I mean, things are very rough in the associate hiring market right now among law firms. I'm not sure what exactly explains that. There was a lot of overhiring in 2021, 22. We're correcting course here. There's probably some getting ramping up. A lot of big law firms are integrating AI into the legal work itself right now, and it's kind of more in testing phases, but that's coming. So it's definitely not a risk-free environment at all.
Okay, when you look back at lawyers and law firms and using thought leadership to grow revenue, right, and to keep revenue with current clients, are there two or three keys to doing this effectively? When you look at your clients who have really taken off with your help and the other clients who haven't, or companies you know of that would never bring somebody like you in the first place, are there any 2 to 3 or 4 keys to what differentiates the successful law firm in using thought leadership from the unsuccessful?
Sure. So some of the commonalities, it's oftentimes organized by and led at the practice group or industry group level. So you think about a big law firm, 1,000+ lawyers. That's a lot of lawyers to manage. Usually you have a relatively small market. I mean, it's big relative to a small firm, but probably not as big of a marketing department as you would have for an organization of that size with that amount of revenue. To try to have a comprehensive thought leadership strategy or process in place for the entire firm without drawing distinctions between your practice groups or your industry area focus, to me, is a mistake. So organization at that level as opposed to the firm level. You need someone to take ownership and be sort of a champion of this process. So with my clients where they've really done well with their thought leadership approach, like it's oftentimes the practice group leader, or it could be someone else at the partner level within one of those groups who's the champion. This is not a call to like hire an outside consultant, but it's the type of person who say like, we need to professionalize our approach here. We need a strategy, we need systems, we need processes, we need accountability, we need someone to come in and tell us what we're doing wrong, that kind of thing. So that's an example of that ownership mindset that someone might take. They have a real feedback loop established with their audience, with their clients, like asking them, what are 2 to 3 things that you don't know that you wish you knew? And then we're going to write about those issues. Having these conversations, understanding what clients want. Lawyers, typically the way they approach things, I would say, would be, Ninth Circuit just issued a new opinion, let's write about it. Okay, but does that reflect anything that a client like needs to know right now or doesn't know? Like, clients are constantly asking themselves, I think, or they're constantly, consciously or subconsciously, expecting of their lawyers, like, tell me something I don't know. I want you to be my trusted advisor. Lawyers say all the time, I think a lot of professional services providers say all the time, I'm a trusted advisor, then prove it, right? Tell me something I don't know. Provide me with the value of your unique vantage point. And do it in a way that is actionable for us, that helps us improve our decision making. So these are all, I think, the mindsets of the lawyers and firms that do this well. They also really understand that the distribution strategy is perhaps not as important, but almost as important as the quality of the writing and the insights in the piece itself. Because again, of course, if no one's seeing this thing, then what does it matter? So again, at a practice group or industry group level, let's say an industry group, let's say there's a law firm focused on the renewable energy industry. Others probably maybe call it something different, but what is the ecosystem of attention of that audience that you're trying to target? And we need to really understand that so we can immerse ourselves and our ideas in that ecosystem. So where we're publishing, where we're speaking, what events we're attending. Like, this is all a reflection of understanding where people in the industry we're targeting are focusing their time and attention. one of the biggest mistakes law firms make is lawyer writes an article, sends it to the marketing department posts it on the website, and then that's it, right? And we're hoping that it gets discovered, and that we know that's a pretty tall order.
I call that the one and done marketing plan.
Yeah, there you go. Let me get this off my plate.
Yeah.
Yep. Check that box. And then just hope for the best. And that's why, when I'm talking to lawyers and we'll talk about marketing, I'll be like, well, I just don't see the value in writing articles. I'm like, well, I know where that's coming from, because you just write the article, it gets posted on the law firm website. And then of course no one sees it or no action is taken upon it. And yeah, you wrote 2 articles in the last 12 months. I mean, you got to kind of lower your expectations if that's your approach. And I guess that relates to my last point, which is the one I alluded to earlier and talked a little bit about, which is they use their thought leadership marketing as a business development asset. So they write something, the lawyers in the practice group all identify their 10 highest potential contacts, and they send an individual email to that person, and they'll say, hey, this is something we think you should know about. It's important. And if you'd like, we'd be happy to jump on a phone call with you for 20 minutes to discuss it and answer any questions you might have. I mean, that's the approach that you need to take. That's why it's important to write for one person, because the more you can contextualize the content, the more you can make it resonate with a particular job title in a particular industry, gosh, the more valuable it'll be.
And the less academic, I imagine it sounds, or the less legalese, the less kind of abstract and...
Oh, totally. Right. Yeah, it should have that. It should not be that way at all. Because yes, you want, if your client is the in-house counsel who can understand your legalese, and if it's written in that way, then it's never going to be forwarded on to the director, the chief operating officer, who maybe doesn't, who really needs to see it. So yeah, you got to write in plain language.
So what do you tell the clients who, they're not just writing for the general counsel, they're writing for the CEO or COO or head of marketing or whatever the legal areas. And your client says, no, I'm really writing for the general counsel. And so I can put all the legalese I want in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a CEO decision. What do you tell them? They say, no, listen, this has to be easily understood by the CEO, who's in most cases not a lawyer, most cases is not. And so we have to, I'll use these words, dumb it down. Okay? You can't just throw legal concepts out there without explaining them. What do you the client who says, no, this is really a general counsel purchase?
Yeah. I mean, at that point, what you're describing is a very stubborn lawyer. And I'm not sure at that point I can do much of anything about it, except I might suggest to them that they ask their client, they ask who they think is their client and say, what are you doing with this information that we're writing for you? Is this something that you can pass on? Because I can say this for sure, and they probably would understand this and appreciate it, would be what lawyers need to do when they're writing substantive emails and memos for their in-house counsel clients. They oftentimes will recognize on their own, or they'll be told, you need to be writing this in a way that can be understood throughout the organization. Because if you don't write that way, then you're putting it on your in-house counsel client to then translate your legalese into something understandable by the rest of the organization. And that's going to piss off the in-house counsel if you continue to write that way, because they want something they can easily forward along.
So for the in-house counsel, it's like you're making him or her do more work, and they don't have the time to translate into this business language.
Yeah, and if you write an article that way, substantive, legal advice, they're going to have to translate that and forward it on, because it's, again, high stakes. If it's a thought leadership article that, it would be nice if others saw this, but they don't need to. Well, they're just going to hit delete, right? Rather than spend time to actually do your job for you. So do their job for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So looking at the state of thought leadership marketing at law firms today versus, say, when you started, how has it changed? Has it changed?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's been a broad recognition that it is very important, and that more lawyers should be doing it. And so you've seen a few things. You've certainly seen sort of the form of thought leadership changing. You see more podcasts, you see more writing, you see more in different forms, like longer form, shorter form, social media content, et cetera. So you're seeing that to a greater extent, I would say. I wouldn't say that you're seeing as much of what I'm describing as that integration of the marketing and business development to the degree that it should be done. And I also still don't think you're seeing some firms do a really good job of this, but you're still not seeing firms do enough on the distribution side of things, right? Again, just defaulting back to the website. But I think there are probably more lawyers writing than there used to be, perhaps. You're seeing more multimedia, sort of different content formats. I think that's been through the growth and evolution of marketing departments, slicing and dicing, pushing lawyers to do things in different forms, and more avenues and platforms to share different forms of thought leadership content growing as well. So I do think you're seeing much more of that. So that's been good. I also think that some of the growth and evolution of the specific platforms that give distribution to legal content, the JD Supras, the National Law Reviews, that's helped because firms are spending tens of thousands of dollars on these distribution channels. So internally, they're pushing more people to create content. Whether or not that's moving the needle as much as it could be for many firms, I'm not sure. And I kind of doubt that. But that being said, I think you're seeing an overall trend in recognition of importance. And there's still, I think, some areas of strategic thinking and execution that need to catch up with that. I do think that, and this is something that I oftentimes talk to my clients about, but I do think firms are recognizing that they need a more visible presence online to showcase their ideas, their thought leadership than was the case, a decade ago, obviously. Research from Gartner talks about sort of the buyer's journey, and you get so little time and maybe no time with the prospective client because they're doing all this due diligence beforehand, winnowing down their options, that kind of thing. I think that hits home with many lawyers and law firms where it's like, all right, we need to have more of a robust digital presence. And that's led to more thought leadership.
So are we saying, the McKinsey Quarterly or McKinsey Publishing equivalents in the legal industry, especially at the big law firms where, there's a quarterly publication or every 6-month publication, and you click on this article that was written 2 years ago, it's still somewhat current. Is that happening?
Yeah, you will see more firms, especially the bigger ones, doing things like the quarterly, securities litigation trends piece or capital markets, this or that. The problem I see with it is that in many cases, all it is sort of just a collection of individual blog posts without any editing, without any through line, without any real analysis, and no original research. And that's probably one of the areas that, if you were to ask me, what are some of the big missed opportunities? That's certainly one, is that in many cases, the legal industry has not caught up to the PwCs, the McKinseys, and Bain and Company with like these original research, surveys, deep analysis, and the kinds of things that the media is going to cite year after year and write about when the report comes out. You know what I'm talking about. Like that's one of the areas where the quarterly and biannual reports that are being issued are to a much greater extent like, here's these 7 related blog posts on employment law that we're just putting in one package.
I've seen that kind of, I would call it best practice research. I've only seen it in one place in the legal industry. And it wasn't even in the legal industry. It was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, set up this Institute for Legal Reform for trade associations whose members were getting sued, class action lawsuits for this and that. And so the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was really way ahead of its time. I think the legal reform may be at least 20 years old. There they said, we're going to do best practice research to understand how the big corporations that were most successful in defending against class action lawsuits, we're going to try to understand what they did differently than the big firms who lost more. right? No matter which law firm they work with, we're not really there to recommend a law firm. We're really there to understand legal practices and business practice. Not to say I look for this, but I'm not aware of any similarly sophisticated, what I would call thought leadership, best practice research going on in law firms. But
yeah, it's not a lot of it.
Not my area of expertise.
Yeah,
it's happening in law firms.
Yeah, there's not as much, and I, I don't. The one thing I try to always remember, because I used to be one, is that part of there is a unique aspect, because we sometimes talk about like, oh, law firms are a little behind other professional services firms, and there's a unique aspect to the practice of law in the legal industry, which is distinct from other areas of professional services, I would say, which is you've got everything you do is subject to being nitpicked to death by opposing counsel that wants nothing more than to uncover the mistakes you made while rushing to meet the court-imposed deadline, which, if you had missed, would have exposed you to malpractice risk and a lawsuit from your client. Like, it's a uniquely challenging and stressful job in that respect, of the adversarial nature of the practice. So it is very hard if you put yourself in the shoes of someone, a litigator who is just, juggling 10 different things and all of these issues and all of the risks and the conflicts with opposing counsel and everything else, to say like, all right, now step away and spend 5 hours writing that article, or like lead the initiative to do an original research survey. So there are missed opportunities, but there are these things that makes it understandable why perhaps lawyers don't produce as much content as they otherwise might, or their contemporaries in other service areas do.
Okay, so imagine yourself as the chief marketing officer of a $1 billion law firm, and you're given, I'm going to say, 2% of revenue. Is that 20 million?
Yeah.
Okay. What are you going to do with that 20 million? What kind of people are you going to have in your marketing and thought leadership department? What skills, and how are you going to spend the money? What are you going to have your people doing?
Well, I mean, one thing I'm going to for sure do is go out and I'm going to hire journalists, because what I think I would recognize would be that, especially in areas where we have an industry concentration, sort of the fragmentation of the market of the media landscape is such where there's no reason why a law firm with its incredibly insightful and smart people and subject matter experts can't become a publishing company that dominates the information flow for that niche industry, or at least is one of the dominant forces in that area. So, I mean, I'm going to really think about how do we become much more of a media company as a means of marketing our services.
The venture capital industry, Andreessen Horowitz, has read things to this effect, saying we're a media company in the VC industry.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That would be certainly one part of the model. I would probably I would use some of that budget to basically put a few of my ambitious and super smart and excellent writing partner level lawyers on sabbatical to write the definitive books on this various aspects of the subject matters and industries they focus on, because I think that still does matter, and it's something that a surprisingly small number of lawyers do, for the reasons that we discussed earlier, of the time crunch and stress and other challenges associated with the practice of law. So those are a couple things that come to mind. I would invest probably heavily in training more people on how to do this effectively, because again, this is one of those areas where you have to both lead the horse to water and really help them to drink and figure out or how to fish, whatever analogy you want to use here, or metaphor. So that that would certainly be another aspect of it. I don't know, I guess that whole idea of like become the publishing company, have the definitive conference, have an amazing podcast, be the not just the reporter, the curator of news, but the insight leader in the space. Like, those would be some big areas of focus, at least from a thought leadership standpoint. I don't know if I'm qualified to use the rest of the budget, because some of these other areas of marketing that they probably need to do fall outside my area of expertise.
Yeah, that's great. Are there any big law firms do you know of any big law firms that in fact have that kind of budget and people doing the things that you're pointing to?
No, I mean, budget, yes. There's now law firms topping what, $4 or $5 billion a year and 10 million per year profits per partner. I mean, the money's there. I just, I don't think it's really, and I could be wrong. Maybe there's some that are, but I'm not aware of them. And it's still you know, lawyers are expected to write the content that gets published by like the marketing team. Oftentimes they'll have, PR people or a PR agency on retainer. They might try to find a publishing home for that content elsewhere. It's the same system, as far as I can tell, that's been going on for the last 2 decades.
And so, what would you tell the managing partner of such a big law firm when he or she says, "That sounds great, Jay, but what's the return?" Tell me, what if we do it well? If all cylinders are firing here, what do we get?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when your prospective clients need information, don't you want them coming to you for that information? And wouldn't that be an opportunity as the definitive source of what's happening in the X industry world to be that source, to be the email newsletter, to be the conference, to be the podcast, et cetera? I mean, we've seen this executed. So one of my favorite stories, and people in the legal industry, frankly, I don't know if you know a gentleman by the name of Scott Becker. He's still a partner at McGuire Woods Healthcare Law. So you'll like this story. You should dig into it, Bob. But I think it was I don't know exactly when, but let's say 30 years ago. I could be, maybe he's 25. He was still an associate and was trying to carve out a space for himself. And he decided that he needed a niche. Say he was like a 6-year associate at the time at a law firm. And he decided this is an emerging area, these ambulatory surgery centers. So sort of independent surgery centers, not on site with the hospital. And he's like, I'm going to start a newsletter. It was a print newsletter. He started just writing it, mailing it out to these clients. I'll just fast forward because it's a long story, but you should research the whole thing. This turned into Becker's Healthcare, which is one of the preeminent publications, conferences, like media empires in the healthcare space, 30 years later. And
I know about Becker's Healthcare, but I didn't know Scott.
So Scott, yes. And Scott has been a very generous mentor to me. I've been on his podcast several times. He's been on mine. I interviewed him for one of my books. I ran into him in Glencoe, Illinois last summer on a soccer weekend with my kids. He was dining at the same restaurant. We had a good opportunity to catch up. It's an incredible story. And he's still he's still practicing law, and he's got this publishing arm that's turned into something incredible. And gosh, has that increased his and his group's authority, reputation, and business as a result of a print newsletter that grew into a media empire.
And it's a great example.
Probably point him to Scott Becker and what he did.
I have to get him on my podcast.
You should. He'd be a great guest.
I'll expect an entree.
I will.
That'd be great. Last 2 questions. Do you see the same thing I see in the evolution of this thought leadership market, especially long after I've retired, and maybe perhaps long after you've retired, where what you've done happens with a lot of niches? There's somebody who specializes in thought leadership in the automotive sector for some reason, or thought leadership in the accounting sector, thought leadership in the staffing industry sector. You see that what you've done and others have done?
Yeah.
Continuing.
I do. For one thing, I think that just, again, people kind of marketing stories about like, you're going to pick the generalized cleaner or the one for the very specific thing you need. I think there's something to having the solution for X industry, X service for Y industry. That will, I think, always be a valuable model for the right client. I do think that will be the case. And I think it's really important because I do think that, to the extent that you are in a field of marketing and thought leadership in particular, you do have to be able to talk to clients, I think, or you will in the future, 10 years from now for forecasting out about, how does this very specifically fit into our revenue generation model? Where is the ROI? How does this work in the life cycle of developing clients in this case? Like, where does this fit in and why do we need it? I mean, there's, 20 different fragments of marketing that you could be doing. Why this? How does this fit in? And really be able to talk to me about the ROI. I mean, I didn't share this story, but like when I started my own firm, I didn't think of it and I didn't use this term at the time, but I picked a niche of clients I wanted to go after as a lawyer, and I wrote for them and I spoke, at their conferences, and I was doing thought leadership marketing, and it worked and it had an impression on me. But you've got to see in that field how that can translate into revenue. And if you don't speak the language of that client and have experience in it and have spotted the patterns and recognized the roadblocks and that kind of thing, I just think that it's going to be hard to be a generalist, increasingly hard to be a generalist, and even more so 10 to 20 years down the road.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So in effect, what we're talking about, I think we're kind of, letting people who are kind of new to this profession, who are thinking of entering this profession, they may be a journalist who are trying to get off that career train, or a consultant or lawyer like you are. We're saying, hey guys and girls, women, there's good opportunities here. Think about thought leadership for venture capital firms, or thought leadership for private equity firms.
Yep.
Or thought leadership for hedge funds. Hedge funds ever wanted to publish anything?
Yeah.
Or they do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. X for Y, thought leadership being X, Y being the industry of choice. And definitely, if you are just one person and you're looking to do it independently, I mean, there's all kinds of opportunities. Almost every market is big enough to support your ambitions, no matter how small it might seem. So go very, very narrow. I mean, if you wanted to go into the legal industry, I would say be the thought leadership consultant and writer potentially for, one very narrow practice group, right? Most law firms have it. And if you can make contact with the right person in that group and be like, I only do this for you, that's going to resonate a lot with someone who otherwise would just be choosing among a bunch of undifferentiated options.
For example, one example could be you go into a big law firm and you say, you have a media practice? Yes, we do. I have learned a lot about the streaming media industry, and I can help you produce thought leadership on that industry because, as we know, things are moving to streaming and they're moving away from over-the-air TV and newspapers. Those industries are dying. But I can help you become the thought leader on the legalities for streaming media companies, right? Would that be an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Totally. Pick the niche and then have a process, law firms like that, meaning, I can help you write this content. I need to sit down for 30 minutes or 15 minutes with your subject matter expert, capture their voice, capture their insights, and then I'll turn around a polished draft that'll get you 90% of the way there for your lawyer to edit. And they'll be very happy with that kind of thing. But, to the extent that you say you can do that for every subject matter, you're going to lose credibility. So, to the extent that you have one or a small number of areas of expertise that you can do that for, you'll be credible. And I think you'll have success.
Yeah, very good. All right, last question, Jay. Where do you see Harrington Communications going over the next 5 years?
Yeah. I would say that the biggest thing's probably continuing to move away from implementation to strategy and training. We've been on that path for a while, but you know how it is. Sometimes you have these revenue streams where they're hard to give up to some extent, but they eat up a lot of your time and effort and oversight. So it's a slow evolution, but we're continuing to make that progression and that shift. So, really that requires a lot of things, the psychological sort of wherewithal and strength to say no to more things, to sharpen your positioning and how you describe what you do for the marketplace, and sort of limit the options of what kind of engagements you take on. But that evolution will continue over time. And I would say part of that's for my own purposes. I'm thinking ahead. I turn 50 in September. So, I want to have, for my own purposes, like a really defined, clear sense of things operating at a high level, more in the strategic and training realms, and moving away from implementation and execution.
Yeah, that's terrific. I'm all ears because I'm about to do age 70, which I will be.
Well, hey, we always have to think about it. I mean, this is one, it might be a subject of another conversation, another podcast episode, frankly. But I mean, I'm the thing that I've written 4 books. I have a 5th on the way. I write a weekly email newsletter. I write a lot of long form content, LinkedIn content, lots of podcast episodes. What I'm super interested in, and I almost need, I feel like, a sabbatical to go really think about this, is like taking all these ideas and consolidating them down into a real clear intellectual property framework, meaning like, what is the framework? What is the big idea that encapsulates all of this crap that we're, I'm always dealing with, working on, talking about, and getting into a real clear framework. The Matt Dixon Challenger sale, or the Seth Godin Purple Cow, or that recognizable piece of insight and packaged insight that, to me, that's a personal objective for like the next several years. I've got to come up with that.
That Matt Dixon's co-author on the Challenger sale, Brent Adamson, is publishing a book soon on frameworks. As I understand it.
Is that right? Oh, okay.
The big, all-defining framework.
Okay, good. I can't wait for that one to come out. I'm going to read it.
All right. Well, I'm happy to compare notes.
Sounds good.
This is great. Well, Jay, thank you so much for your time. I wish you great success. You don't need my best wishes. I think you're going to go even further over the next 5 years. And I'm very interested to see where you are 10 years ago, see the evolution of your business.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Bob. This was a real pleasure. And I admire you and appreciate your mentorship and friendship.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a like and if you shared the episode with your colleagues. Everything Thought Leadership is a video and podcast series from Buday TLP. It's for thought leaders and thought leadership professionals, the people who help experts get recognized as thought leaders. You can find out more about Buday Thought Leadership Partners at budaytlp.com.